in the Eval Forward channels. I'd like also to invite you to use the chat to share your questions, and then we hope to have time also to share some live experiences from other of you that are here today from your experience in using these approaches. So just let me now hand over to Steph for his introduction on these methods. Thanks, Steph. Over to you.
Thank you, Renata. Thanks for inviting me to do this introduction on working with stories and more precisely micro-narratives in evaluation. My name is Steph Depree. I'm calling in from Brussels in Belgium. And I've been working a long time in monitoring and evaluation and learning positions, and along the way had the chance to get to know narrative methods, and now it's basically what I do with Voices That Count, a group of practitioners and experts that are using narrative methods for monitoring and evaluation, understanding social impact, more and more citizen engagement and participation trajectories as well. We are working with narratives throughout most of the work that we do, and a lot of what we do, and I always refer to this drawing here that it's a picture from a conference of 3-4 years ago, the American Evaluation Association. And it really reflected like how what we do. We are interested in individual stories of people. That's the starting point, the individual experiences and moments that matter. But if you put them together and you collect large amounts of these stories, you start to see patterns across the different stories. You are starting to see the diversity in the voices. You also see the collective story that is emerging. And that's what we try to do through different type of methods, and trying to read the system from within, to see the reality through the eyes of the people, through the experiences that they share. And as Dave Snowden is often saying, is we try to see reality as it is in order to act in it. Yeah? And stories are a good way to tap into a certain type of reality. I'm referring to here to two methods, and also the speakers after me will refer to one or the other methods. And a lot of the work we do is inspired by Sensemaking from Cognitive Edge and Dave Snowden, as well as Cynthia Kurtz, who wrote a very nice book for all those interested in working with stories. I can highly recommend it. And she also has this method called participatory narrative inquiry, which for me in the fundamentals are relatively the same. There are some small changes between the two methods, but I think in essence they are after the same thing. And that's also what I will try to explain now in the little time we have. So we always start with a story. We always start with that people share and experience a moment of something they have lived through. We are not so much interested in large constructed stories in this approach. That's also why we call it micro narratives. It's more the day-to-day experiences that people have and they share, like what we would share if we walk in a corridor or somewhere waiting on a bus stop or in an elevator, the quick talks we have. It's that kind of experiences and sharing of moments that we try to share. And people decide themselves what they want to talk about and share what is important to them. When we turn this into the method of working with these micro narratives, we always start with what we call the prompting question. And most of the time, the prompting question is the same for each and every respondent, each and every storyteller that is participating in the listening exercise. Here, for instance, there is a question: share a recent experience about a challenge that you faced and how you have dealt with it. Describe what happened. This was part of an evaluation that we did for Tipping Point a few years ago in Care, Bangladesh. And you see the type of stories that are generated. They are not large stories. They are short fragments, narrative fragments, we call them. And they are written in the way that people have written them down. We don't change them. They are taken exactly as they are generated at the moment of collection. This in itself is not so special. I mean, there are more methods, narrative methods, that are generating narratives and stories, moments, experiences. What I think makes the method or the approach unique is that we are going to allow storytellers to self-interpret their own story. And we do that based on a set of follow-up questions that allow the storyteller to make a primary assessment of their own story that they just shared. And by doing so, they give more meaning to the story, more than what we can read in the words or what is shared through the words. There is always more to the story than what we say, than what we can write down. And we also try to tap into these things that haven't been explicitly mentioned, but that we find important in view of the study, the evaluation, or whatever reason you are using this approach. And we are literally trying to find out the topics, the aspects, the dynamics, the drivers, norms, values, things that are not explicitly in the words and that we under the surface and that we try to reveal. We do that based on a set of questions, and there are different type of questions you can ask for that, or you can use for that. Simple multi-choice questions. These are 3 questions I took from a peace building project where we were prompting for situations and moments where people felt that they had to deal with conflict or peace situations. Questions that give some more insight in the nature of the stories, but also questions that we or topics or concepts that we try to understand that are associated to the topic of interest. For instance, the triad question there, you can see people have to indicate whether the actions were driven by people's belief, tradition, cultures, or law and rules, which people can position their own story in, and that will then generate patterns. If we collect not 10 stories, not 20, but hundreds or even sometimes thousands of stories in a particular community or setup, and that allows us to generate patterns. I think that's what I think is the unique part on this method. Is we start from stories, we start from micro narratives, which are self-interpreted by the storyteller, but which allow us then to turn that material into patterns, and where we can see patterns and trends across the groups, the subgroups, the context that we are interested in. These days, there are many ways of visualizing these patterns. There is the dedicated software, the Sensemaker, Firm, Tableau, Power BI, Excel, if you want. I mean, there are many ways of generating these patterns, because at the end, we start with narrative material, but we turn it into numeric material, Excel or CSV data that can be used in almost all the applications. And it's these patterns that are emerging from all the stories that have been collected that provide us with rich insights that I think, especially when you move into more than 50 or 100 stories, you can't generate with your manually with your brain anymore. There are limits there. And the visualization and the possibilities of using some statistical tools will help us to see things that we can't see literally through all stories by just reading them. The patterns in itself tell a story. You can also parse them into, depending on the demographic questions you have asked and so on. And more, we also use dashboards and preset applications that are built around, especially when we go for ongoing or periodic collection of stories, where we can keep track of the stories coming in and make sense of them and analyze them and bring back the stories to the groups that need to work with them or act upon them. An important part of the whole process, it's not about only collecting stories and the process of listening and also making some, spotting some nice trends and patterns, but also to make sense of it together with the people that need to work with them. If it's evaluation, it's people doing the evaluation, it's the partners involved, it's the storytellers to provide even additional meaning by bringing back the stories, discussing the patterns together. So this is for us an important step in the process. Where the transformation, the empowerment, the ownership, the creating of insights is generated as part of the evaluation process or the sense-making process. In general, where the way we use these methods is in 4 types of areas. One is supporting strategic planning. It's future-oriented policy formulation, design, in inception phase, even baseline studies and so on. Foresight applications. More and more, as I said, also in citizen participation, citizen engagement initiatives by cities and local governments. Of course, the real-time monitoring, if you can do it ongoing in programs and projects. And the topic of today, evaluations, impact evaluations, formative or others, that people can use these methods. Maybe to close down, for evaluation specifically based on the experience in guiding some of the even organizations that are here and others, is that Sensemaker, P&I are often used in mixed methods approaches, evaluation approaches. I hardly see it used as a standalone method for the evaluation. And it's really working well. And it brings an additional type of an extra type of data to the table as well. And by experience, I've also learned that it's quite interesting to do it in one of the earlier methods in the process, because it also generates hypotheses which you can then further work on with the other methods that you will apply. And I think the IFAD case has also worked in this approach. I always try to promote also the participatory character, the pure representational parts, trying to find as many voices as possible, also those that are often not heard. It's one way, but also making sense together of the data to make sure that the data is validated, that the data is actually also further inspired and further gets more meaning by the people involved, to even the process of listening and the process of sense making, creating more ownership, informing and inspiring people to take action and moving forward and being empowering in itself. Yeah. One of the things that is quite important, I think, for evaluation purposes in the use of this method is that in essence, we are asking experiences and moments, as I explained earlier. But when we go for an evaluation, there is an evaluative character to the tool as well, and we want to understand the merits of a program, the changes that have happened, and also in the best case, how the program has contributed and so on. In the design process, this has consequences for the prompting question we are asking and also the follow-up question. So we often see a mix of the more traditional questions we are asking for P&I or for Sensemaker, but it often leans towards here and there some more typical survey questions, because we are asking the opinion and not the description of an experience around a particular aspect of the context. The pitfall there is that we are not ending up in another type of survey or questionnaire, but stay loyal to the original ideas and the concepts that we have with this methods. And one of the important things is that not all the questions should be directly related to your hypothesis, but leave it open for also surprises, that both in the narratives and both in the patterns, that we can be open for surprises and also allow for that in the sense making process. Yeah. So I think I will leave it here and then hand over to Renata for, I think, some questions, maybe first.
Yes. Questions? Thanks, Steph. Thanks so much for your presentation. I think it was very clear. I see that there are two questions here. One is by our Ponge. I hope I pronounce correctly the name. He's asking which app is that used for the demo dashboard? And I think she's referring to the software you're using. Yes.
Yeah, that's a software. That's a dashboard we have created for one of the applications that we have in this. I think it was Forum Voices. It's yeah, a dashboard we created based on this data. There are Power BI can create dashboards, Tableau. We have our own. We can. Sensemaker comes with a very nice dashboard. I mean, there are many options there. Yeah.
Then there is a question by Carrie Abbott. Why limited and identifying the type of conflict to only 2 types? I think she's referring to the example you made of the type of conflicts. You identified there were 2 options.
Yeah, well, it's also something we learned. This is part of the design process. Sometimes it's take all that applies. Sometimes it's maximum 2, maximum 3, maximum 1. It depends on how we want to work with the data. It's a design decision in narrative survey.
Another question is by Ian Hopwood. Any suggestion and advice about the use of these methods with children and adolescents and youth, both as informants and also as evaluators?
Yeah, very good. So I would say the youngest I've done is girls between 12 and 16, 17 years old in Rwanda. It's working perfectly. I think we can use the same app, the same application. We have to be a bit attentive in the way you facilitate it during the listening and the story collection. Another story is when you are going to younger people. We are doing a first project actually with kids now in Hawaii, where we are turning this method into a play. So we are collecting the stories in a playful way. It's a game, but at the same time we are asking basically the same concepts, and the way of taking note of the answers is also a bit different. But at the end, we use the app to store all the information. Yeah. But it's, I would say, 12, 13 years. It's like an age where things are changing.
I'll go with the other 2 questions. One is by Silva Ferretti. From the presentation, the approach seems mainly a way to ask participants to categorize their stories. But meaning is at a deeper level. How do you dig it out? So meaning, how do you dig it out? And then there's another question by Dana Newsom. Do you record the interviews and translate them later, or rely on note-taking only?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was the last one. It's technically possible to take the recordings, of course, and then transcribe them. There is, of course, a serious work that has to be done afterwards to do it. But we have done it, and I think maybe in one of the cases it was also done. It's a matter of, I think, probably resources available to work with those. We often work with enumerators that are capable of, even if it's recorded, immediately transcribe it, write it up. And especially in cases where people are illiterate and can't write it down themselves, then we need to have people that take note of the stories as they are told and then be validated by the people, of course. But it's technically possible. At the end, in the system, to work with it, we usually like to have the narratives written up, because otherwise we have to, in the analysis, you have seen the patterns, And it's with one mouse click, you can indicate the patterns you would like to investigate and read the story packs that are associated to a particular pattern, which is going very quick in the analysis. And it's a very nice way to analyze stories. But if you have to work with MP3 files on and off constantly, it's a bit more difficult, I would say. In terms of the meaning, well, it's really working in terms of the art of the method is asking the right follow-up questions, of course, and there you can really go quite deep. I mean, you reveal quite a lot by asking these additional questions. But of course, there is also the follow-up, which is the participatory collective sense-making workshops that you organize with either the storytellers or a representative group of the storytellers, or with even other people, and do story reading and analysis of the patterns where more and meaning is given and additional layers are provided.
I'll just take a final question before we go to the other presentation, then we can come back to other questions. Is this method relevant for illiterate people, or it could be used, or could it be used for educated people? By Roger Afahu.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely useful. I mean, telling stories, everybody can tell stories, and if they have the right prompting question, there's no problem. People will tell their story. So you have to think about how you record it, how you take note of it, and also the interpretation afterwards with a follow-up question. It's all doable. We are working with pen paper with applications, but also with embodied signification, we call it, which mean we are people literally going to stand in between two extremes where they position and their story, and it takes a bit longer, but it's a perfectly possible way of doing the follow-up questions. So it's also a matter of being a bit creative there in how you organize it.
Yeah, I see another question that came up. How do you ever, and then we pass to the others, do you ever use recordings of stories as prompts?
Do you use recordings of stories as prompts? Not that I know of. No, normally the prompting question is defined as part of the design. There is another variation to the method where scenarios or articles or statements are presented, and then people can react to that in the form of a story and then later, but that's a bit of another method. That's the closest I think that it would come to what is asked here.
Okay, thanks, Steph, and thanks to participants for your questions. I will now pass the floor to Fabrizio Felloni, who will take us through the IFAD experience in using participatory narrative inquiry in Cameroon and in Niger. Over to you, Fabrizio. You're muted, Fabrizio.
Yes. Thank you very much, Renata, and I hope you can hear my voice now and also see the slides.
Yes, we see.
Perfect. Both. Okay, so good afternoon or good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. So I'm going to present very briefly the examples of use of participatory narrative inquiry in IFAD evaluation. So I also pay tribute to my colleague, Michael Carbon, who thanks to his collaboration and his leadership, we managed to realize these PNIs in the IFAD context. So just to say that the two cases that I will be presenting, and I hope I can turn the slide. Yes, these two refer to two experiences in Cameroon and Niger. In both cases, let me just anticipate that what we used participatory narrative inquiry as one of the several methods or data collection methods that were available in the evaluation. In the case of Cameroon, this was a country program evaluation. So we were looking at several projects funded by IFAD and also the strategy of IFAD in the country. In the case of Niger, this was a project impact evaluation, so individual project. And in the case of Cameroon, also what we did, we used the PNI to triangulate with secondary data, such as data that coming from a monitoring and evaluation system of the project and project documentation. And in Cameroon, we conducted a PNI with cooperative members, 600 members, men and women. In the case of Niger, what we did there was both a PNI and a quantitative survey, as you can see, with 1,350 households. In the case of PNI, we had two elements there. One was dedicated exclusively to women, 540 women, with and without project support. And another one was with farmers and traders. So as you can see, two different cases with two different scopes, and also in different methods. But the common trait was that we triangulate with among different sources. Now, what was the value added of PNI? You know, projects typically rely on assumptions and sometimes theory of changes. But sometimes the more you look at the micro level, the more you find there's some flaws or some assumptions which are not really correct. So what really in these two cases the PNI helped us do was to highlight, first of all, critique the theory change of the projects and highlight what were really the mechanisms that were working, generating impact. So sometimes they differ from what the project had expected. And also it had helped us highlight the preference and values of people, what they really prefer, what they really wanted to do, and some of the invisible social dynamics, which were in a way not identified in the project documentation and in the project theory change, but they became visible through the PNI. And also emotions, fears, feelings about that the project users, the beneficiaries had. As an example, in Cameroon, we shed light on how the project were really generating impact. So mostly was through production and storage, and less so through market linkages, which was instead one of the assumptions held by the project. And also, we clearly saw that the diversification into different sort of crops rather than expanding individual crops was really what farmers wanted. And there were a number of social dynamics at play, some risk of elite capture, some mechanisms for inclusion, exclusion of members in cooperative. So that's something that came out really clearly through the PNI. In Niger, as you may have seen, we emphasize women. So we have a PNI done conducted only with women, and we had a number of information that we gathered through the PNI on how monetary and in-kind contribution changed the perception of women in the household, and also some mechanisms that were at play and help women break the seasonal crisis that happen, particularly when you have a problem of low stocks and high prices of products, for example, cereals. And it showed, for example, how certain interventions such as goat raising in the project and also building cereal warehouses at the community level help women break the cycle of seasonal hunger and indebtedness. And there was a whole system of exploitation of women indebtedness in the area, which the project, by having this small intervention, helped reduce. And interestingly, these were interventions that perhaps didn't receive enough attention, we found, from the project managers in the later stage of the project development. So it looked at how micro mechanisms help really improve life and reduce risks for beneficiaries. And also, it clarified how certain emotions and fears about being food secure and being indebted led to certain decisions that women and households made in the use of resources and investments. Last point I wanted to share with you is about the PNI, conducting a PNI. It requires, it's of course useful in terms of the type of information that you gather. Very important, you wouldn't be able to have the same type of quality of information. It requires time, so it's not a rapid method. In both cases, the duration of the PNI was about 4 to 5 months from beginning to the end. Note that they were part of larger evaluation. Both evaluation overall took about 1 year to conduct, and the 4 or 5 months was what the PNI took us to conduct. Required reconstructing theory of change, requires still a sampling strategy, and time to design and pretest the questionnaire and prepare some story prompting. Time also to learn the software function. As you can see, we use 2 different functions in the 2 exercises. And then the time for what we call the catalysis, which is identifying patterns and relationships in the data. So I will stop here, and I will be available to answer any question that the colleagues and the audience may wish to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I see, for the moment, I see no questions, but I see if there's any participants who want to share their experience, if there's anyone who has a practical experience such as the one that Fabrizio showed, or similar or different ones using these methods. If perhaps we can take one example, if there is anyone wanting to share. Or shall we go to Michael and then share later and see if there are stories from others or questions? Okay, I will then pass the floor to Michael for his example in WFP using Sensemaker. Over to you, Michael. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me also share my screen. All right, is that visible for you?
It is,
yes.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, so we tried in WFP to use participatory narrative inquiry and sense-making, basically, in a big global staff survey that was conducted as part of the data collection for a strategic evaluation of WFP's use of technologies in constrained environments. Now, this evaluation was designed around the 4 main components of a technology use system, which comprised then, 4 components, and around each of these components, we had formulated the main evaluation questions, as you can see here on this diagram. People was a very important component of this evaluation, so we found it very important that we would get inputs from a very large portion of the users of the technology in WFP. Digital technologies have become really a key strategic factor in WFP to enable us to improve the time and the cost efficiency and the quality of the assistance that we provide, but also to help us adapt and increase operational resilience to changing conditions, to constraints and risks. And of course, we also need technology and use it now to meet donor expectations, including in terms of accountability. And this evaluation specifically looked at how WFP is using technologies and how equipped the agency actually is to make use of the most appropriate technologies, with a focus on digital technologies to achieve its objectives in the most constrained conditions. It also looked at the flip side of the medal, so to speak, where it looked at how or to what extent WFP was managing the increasing risks in relation to the technologies that it chooses to deploy. And this was an important dimension also in the stories that we collected from staff. Just to say constrained conditions, what did we mean with that? That these were actually the humanitarian access constraints, so logistical challenges, insecurity and so on. But we also included there the constraints that we can face in the field to use technology itself, so related, for example, to the IT infrastructure, mobile networks, but also social and political constraints. So The purpose of the survey itself was to collect information about first-hand experience from WFP staff and how satisfied they actually were with the use of digital technologies and data in the different constrained environments they were working. And the survey was therefore targeted specifically at WFP personnel. The survey was not, of course, conducted in a vacuum, but it was complementary to country case studies that we conducted in 6 countries, which also themselves involved surveys with beneficiaries, surveys, interviews, focus group discussions with other stakeholders, and so on. Then we had a qualitative global level analysis that focused on evaluating at a broad and general level how the use of technology in WFP played a role across different organizational levels. And then we also conducted a comparative learning exercise where we had several interviews with UNICEF, ICRC, Mercy Corps, and a couple of other organizations to look at how they were going through their digital transformation. Now a bit more about the survey itself. So very different from what Fabrizio presented. In our case, the survey was conducted entirely online. And so it was a self-administered survey. We used the Sensemaking platform to capture micro-narratives and provide a lens and a signification framework to make sense of people's experiences and perceptions. Now, the electronic survey was prepared in 3 languages to be able to catch as many staff as possible. We had so it's basically what Steph had explained. We had a prompting question to trigger the description of an experience. We had signifiers. So these are the questions that helped us to, that were framed around the experience and were narrowly connected to the lines of inquiry of the evaluation about, for example, usability of technology, appropriateness of the context, the nature of constraints faced, and so on. And then we had also a set of additional questions that were not related directly to the story, to the micro-narrative. And these covered, for example, main areas of improvement and overall ratings on WFP, WFP's ICT strategy, financing for the use of technology, the quality of technical assistance, and things like that. That we also wanted to get a broad, view over by having this survey with a lot of staff. And then finally, we had a set of identifier questions. So that, for example, that helped us then to classify orders, responses according to sex, age, location, main area of work, and so on. So the sampling for this survey was a self-selected convenient sample. It means that we did not force anyone to participate. We did not do a pre kind of sampling. All staff in WFP were invited initially, but then we sent targeted reminders throughout the data collection period for about a period of 6 weeks to encourage participation from an as diverse possible group of staff. So to make sure that we had kind of balanced representation across gender, also across the types of technologies people spoke about in the stories, levels of humanitarian access constraints met in the countries, and so on. And in total, we collected close to 900 experiences. So the survey was anonymous, and participants, of course, were asked to provide informed consent based on a standardized information sheet in the beginning of the survey, and so on. And then perhaps most importantly, after we collected the information and ran it through the software to do some analysis, trends analysis, and so on, we organized also sense-making workshops. We actually organized 2. Each of these had about 50 participants to help us interpret the stories and the patterns and the trends and so on in a participatory manner together with staff, the WFP staff. And we collected qualitative insights during the workshop using different systems, including a comment board, and we did focus group discussions and so on. Now I can just show you, I mean, just very quickly, just to make it a little bit more practical, the prompting question that we used. So basically, we asked people to reflect, you know, upon or within the work, their work with WFP, and to share us a positive or a negative experience with using digital technology in operations in constrained environments. So this is literally the text that we put on the survey. In italic, we put some kind of some additional text to really emphasize that it was important for people to take the time to answer this question, because the rest of the survey, of course, depended on the story, on the micro narrative that people had shared with us. But we allowed people to also share experiences that they had heard about, so not only experiences that they had gone through personally. And this way we collected stories, all kinds. So these are just a couple of examples. There is no time for you to read everything, but basically, in many cases, the stories were about experiences with using remote tools, so digital tools for remote work or for remote data collection and so on. And people often talked about pros and cons. So that was very helpful for us to get kind of a balance, not only learn about negative things, but also see where there were good practices and so on. This is an example of one of the slider questions we asked. So we were asking people, the digital technology or data used in your story is difficult to use or is easy to use? And then people could answer that. And with the help of the software, we can then see how these answers are distributed over the whole range. And you can see that the vast majority found the technology easy to use. But it's also interesting then to run like analysis within the different categories of participants that we had identified through these identifier questions. And we can see that, for example, in low constrained environments and in highly constrained environments, the two graphs look very, very similar. And so one of the conclusions there was that the level of constraint in the environment for many people is not really seen as a big issue in terms of the ease of use of the technology. This is an example of a triad question. So the question was then, what were the main challenges that you faced in the use of the technology in your story? And here people could put these dots on the triangle, and you see all the dots from all the respondents on the left side. And then again, we could apply filters and see, for example, whether people that had said in another question that the technology they talked about was difficult to use, whether they would have a different explanation for what the reasons were for that technology to be difficult to use. And indeed, we see a difference between the patterns. So difference between the overall results and the specific results for those people who had said that their technology was difficult to use. For example, we see that a lot more people are kind of blaming the context and external factors. Are blaming the quality and the performance of the technology itself. And then that actually the context or external factors seem to become a lot less important in their judgment. Now, the main challenges we faced by conducting this survey online, I would say, was that, okay, first of all, the participants were self-selected. So we had absolutely no control actually on who would participate. And it is not clear, therefore, how the experience was of non-participants. And it's possible that some participants did not participate to the survey because they they were not really motivated or interested, and these people could have had very interesting stories to tell. Through an electronic survey, it's much more difficult to motivate people to participate in a survey. About half the stories shared with us were stories related to remote working. That's because we were working right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Sorry. And then finally, was also difficult for us to get real stories. And stories usually should be talking about a specific event that has been lived through by a person or by a group, and it should usually have an emotional dimension as well. So it should include what people have felt about it, and it should include also how the person has perceived that experience. So it's ideally, a story is really something, it's really about a personal experience. And many of the stories that we collected were not personal. So they were, for example, yes, in WFP, we have introduced this or that to solve this problem. General statements like that, or there would be judgments or general opinions about technology use, but without having without talking about the personal experience. So, for example, they would say, okay, this technology has really helped us a lot, but there are these and these risks that some people get excluded, for example, and so on. These stories or these experiences are also useful, of course, but they are more difficult than to use later on, to apply the signifier questions on in a really meaningful way. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to share with you today.
Thanks, Michael. Fabrizio, there are a few questions I'd like to take because they're also referring to Fabrizio's presentation. So there are a few questions about what the software did you use and what the difference is between the software used. Yes, basically by Richard, Nathan, and Daniela, they were all asking similar questions about the software used and the differences. So perhaps we can take that one.
Thank you. There are many similarities between software available. There's two differences fundamentally. One is the type of graphical outputs that allow you to do so. Some software allow you to come up with the triads diagrams, such as in the example that Steph and Michael have presented, and others have other graphic outputs. The other difference is about licensing, whether you need a license to access the software or not, and some do need and others don't. So and that's the two fundamental differences. So graphic outputs and functions that they have to show the results of the PNIs, and the other one is whether you require a license in order to use it. I think these are the two fundamental differences. Over.
There are a couple of more questions for Fabrizio. Just a moment. By Carrie Abbott, she asks, is this used at the planning stage more helpful results than the evaluation phase only? This is a question. I think she means if you can use this at the planning stage. And then if you can say a bit more about how you collected data for the PNI. It seems you created questionnaires. So what is it more like a survey? In this regard, there's also a comment by Silva Ferretti. She mentions that surveys, including qualitative and participatory narratives, are fundamentally different exercises, but this distinction did not emerge much in this webinar, and she hopes that these two will not be conflated. So
certainly important point raised by our colleagues here participating. In fact, what in the case of that I presented, for example, Niger, in this case, we had both another exercise, parallel exercise, which was a survey, and the PNI. The PNI doesn't work exactly through questionnaire. It works more, in our case, through story prompts. And the story prompts ask, in our case, also general question, for example, asking respondents to narrate a story which shows an important decision that they made for the households and what it was about. or an important change which could be positive or negative that happened to their households or to the way in which they produce, they sell, they process their agricultural produce in the past 5 years. So general questions were not referred directly to a project, what a project did, but to their own experience. So it's different. The other question, so it's important to distinguish between the two, and thank you for in a way underline this. The other question, which was about whether you can use a PNI at a stage, different stage other than evaluation. In our case, we work in evaluation, we use in evaluation. I can tell you that I've seen examples in the health sector, for example, of PNIs or similar used in midterm reviews of projects. So not at final evaluation, but during a relatively early stage of a program, reviewing the progress made. So the answer is we have used it for evaluation. Yes, it can be used at other stages. And I think it can also be used, as you have seen in the presentation that we made before. It's also a useful tool also to test some of the assumptions, explicit or implicit, that we may make in the intervention. So yes, I would say it can be used also in other stages of the project development. I think it's so. Did I miss any question, Renata?
I don't think so. I'll pass on the question. There are many coming in, so in the interest of time, two questions for Michael here. What was the overall response rate to the survey by Nathan? And then another, Muhammad, did you use any incentives to help motivate people to participate in the survey? Example, complete entries have a chance to win an iPad. That would be nice. Over to you, Michael.
Yes, sorry, it takes a while to unmute on my computer. So yes, we had an 83% response rate. In terms of what we were expecting, we expected about 1,150 people to respond, and we got 858, close to 900 responses. But obviously, as we had sent out a message to all staff in the beginning of the survey, that's about maybe 20,000 people globally. So if you then look at the percentage, we are around 16%, maybe 17% response rate overall. We didn't give any presents or any incentives, even though I thought about it, but yeah, it was not accepted. But it would have been maybe a good idea to promote response. However, what we did is when we did the more targeted follow-up, we saw the kind of demographics and the regions and so on where we got most responses from. And then we started writing directly to the country directors for selected country offices where we knew that the conditions where the WFP was working were particularly constrained. And we wrote to these country directors to please share the survey announcement with their staff and kind of talk about this in staff meetings and so on. And that was really helpful, because then suddenly we got 6 or 7 country offices, including DRC, South Sudan, Bangladesh, and so on, where within a week we got 30 or 40 responses in one go. I hope that answers your question. Oh, sorry, obviously we are not talking about statistically representative samples here. Our intention is not to do statistics. Over.
Yes, there are a few more questions. There's a question for our panel members. What are your favorite go-to exercises or tools for exploring stories and sensemaker data with storytellers? And then there's another question for Michael, I think. What was the difficulty in applying the signifier questions that you mentioned? I'll stop here, then there are a couple more.
I can maybe answer some of the thing on this sense-making exercises. That it really depends on the purpose. Huh? I mean, what if we use this approach for guiding strategic planning, policy formulation of future actions, we are using different approaches of sense making of the stories and the patterns than what we do for an evaluation exercise. Yeah, with evaluation, it's partly validation, it's generating hypotheses, which can then be tested further in other evaluation steps, whether it's focus groups or other questionnaires or any other tools. If we go for, like, for instance, for strategy, we mingle it a bit with a perceptive inquiry kind of approaches. In the discovery phase, it's used with this large-scale listening as part of the discovery, and then from there we go to the dream and design stage. And then we use this kind of approaches. When you do use it for real-time monitoring, because this approach is, we are talking mainly now about evaluation, but it's also very powerful for internal monitoring and evaluation purposes. We also design and use the signifiers, the questions, the follow-up questions in such a way that they provide insights in are we on track? Are we seeing the things we would like to see? And literally, are we seeing, like asking questions, how can we make sure that next time we see more stories like this and less stories like this? And what can we do now in our capacity as a project, as a program in the coming 6 months or year to make sure that we can change the patterns there? So it's providing sense of direction for your intervention. So it's grounded in this adaptive management. So the exercises you do there for sense making are much more geared towards action oriented planning. And basically, yeah, it's the stage, or what you do is highly dependent, I think, is partly on facilitation skills and arsenal of tools and methods and approaches you have there to work further with the stories. And also the availability of people. Is it 5 people, or you have to work like with 50 people or 80 people? It's a different kind of process.
There are a couple of more questions, but I'd like to reiterate the invitation I had before. If there's anyone that has, like, we're running out of time, I know, but if there's anyone that in the audience that has their experience to share very briefly, we're bearing on the patience of participants, because we are running out of time. But I wonder if there's anyone still that has a brief story experience to share.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Adeline. I wrote in the chat that I use Sensemaking for my dissertation. I wanted to confirm that you can also analyze the data that you did not collect yourself. For me, what I did, I just analyzed the data for Madagascar and then for young people. And reading their stories, analyzing the patterns, I could really write a big report. While I didn't participate in data collection, I understand it's very challenging, but since they provide the meaning to their stories, it's also helped the person doing the analysis to fit into their shoes, that like feel how they felt when they're sharing the story. That's what I wanted to share for myself. I think it's a good methodology that WFP could use in several projects.
Thank you. The sound was not great, but thanks for sharing your story and your experience with your thesis. I see also Christine Bosch here. I think you have worked with this. Sorry for calling you in. Would you like to share briefly your experience?
Yes, I can share briefly.
Yeah.
I have also used it in Madagascar and also with young people. It was in the framework of an evaluation of agricultural training programs for young people. And yeah, the reasons why we used it was also, besides that we didn't want to do a large quantitative survey, that the young people were very shy in answering. So the storytelling actually gave them an opportunity to tell about their experiences, which they would not have done in focus group discussions or even in surveys. Yes, so maybe there are some questions. I don't know. I would stop at this point.
It's 3 minutes past 4. I see also another hand raised by Anwar. Do you want really 30 seconds for your experience?
Okay, thank you so much for the presenters for the wonderful presentations. I just wanted to find out when you are doing the participatory story telling or story gathering, yeah, are the participants aware of the implementing organizations? And if they're not aware, then how are we likely to derive the element of contribution of the implementing partners or the intervention to the project? Thank you.
Who wants to answer? Michael, please.
Okay. I was just waiting for the unmute. Sorry. No, in the case of the, I mean, in the different cases that we've presented, obviously the WFP online survey, it was very clear that this was WFP surveying its own staff. I mean, there is no question of people not knowing that this is within the framework of a project or an evaluation. But in the cases that Fabrizio talked about in Cameroon, for example, we tried not to identify ourselves as being from the project itself. Of course, we had to tell people that we were from IFAD and that we were doing an evaluation. But as it was a country strategy and portfolio evaluation, we were not talking specifically about the project. However, the prompting question we used was formulated in a way that would get us stories for sure related to the project, because we asked people, since you joined the cooperative, what has changed in your lives? Can you tell us about specific things that have changed? And here, the cooperative had been, we knew that the cooperative had been, I would say in many cases even created, but often supported and enhanced a lot thanks to the project. So we made that connection through the prompt without revealing that we were interested in that particular project's effects. In the case of Niger, we were doing it in the framework of a specific project impact evaluation. And there it was not possible. I mean, and also it would not have been ethical to hide the fact that we were doing an evaluation of a particular project. So people knew that we were doing this research in the framework of an evaluation of a specific project. But there the prompting question was not related to the project specifically, because we asked the woman, can you tell us in the last 3 or 4 years about an important decision that was made in your family? What happened? That was basically the question. And we got stories, a lot of stories related to wedding, to religious ceremonies, women taking part in decisions related to sending children to school and so on. But then we got quite important portion about women trying to convince their husbands to be able to go to work outside of the household, or women talking about influencing their husband agricultural production, giving advice to their husbands. So there were a lot of stories that we could link directly to the project as well. And then of course the signifier questions gave us more connection to specific project activities and effects. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think it answers my question. Thank you.
It's always difficult to end these sessions when there's still activity and interest going on, but I think we should close, unfortunately. There are a couple of suggestions for follow-up sessions on this. So I think we should consider taking taking them on board and continue with other sessions to evolve forward or beyond evolve forward also. But yes, I think it's time to thank everyone for this really lively discussion and knowledge sharing, and see you next time. And as I said, we will follow up with all of you, with all registered participants. There are participants who are still coming in because with these online meetings, people confuse, it's normal, I think, to confuse time zones. But we'll follow up with all the over 200 participants who registered to this meeting today. So you'll hear from us soon. Thank you all. Thank you, speakers, and thank you, participants, for your active involvement.
And thank you so much, Renata, for your great
Goodbye,
facilitation.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Steph. Thank you, Fabrizio.
Yeah,
Be in touch.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks to all of you and to Renata and to the WFP colleagues, communication that helped us set up also this one, and Michael for the initiative, of course.
Thank you, great. And we'll see each other at Copenhagen next week, I guess.
I'm in Copenhagen next week. I'm there only the 8th and the 9th because the 10th I have to travel back. When are you presenting, Steph? When do you remember?
On the 10th, yeah.
On the 10th, oh no.
Yes.
No, unfortunately, to travel back in the morning.
Yeah, but yeah, you know it.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Fabrizio, Steph, Renata. I'm going to end the meeting. Well done.
Thanks to you. Thanks to you for support, technical support.
Great. Well done. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.